Singularity.
My name is Nicola, aka Socrates, and you're watching Singularity FM, the place where we interview the future. If you guys enjoy this podcast, you can show your support by either writing a brief review on iTunes or by simply becoming a patron via patreon.com or via interviewthefuture.com. Today, my guest on the show is Professor Massimo Pigliucci. Massimo is one of those very rare and strange people who, if I have this right, has 3 PhDs, one in genetics, one in evolutionary biology, and one of all things in philosophy. And he's also the author of 165 technical papers in both science and philosophy, as well as a number of books on Stoic philosophy, including the one that I just finished reading a couple of days ago, called How to Be a Stoic, Using Ancient Philosophy to Live a Modern Life. So, welcome to Singularity FM, Professor Pigliucci.
It's a pleasure to be here. Thank you.
Fantastic. So today I invited you here to have a conversation with you about philosophy, ethics, technology, AI, transhumanism, and daily practice of how we can approach those challenges that we all face in our lives. But let us start perhaps at the beginning. Who is Massimo Pigliucci? If you meet someone who's never met you before in their life and you're like in a bar drinking beer or something and he says, "Nice to meet you, Massimo. So tell me about you. Who are you? Who is Massimo Pigliucci?" What would you tell them?
That's a good question. And I'm afraid that my answer would start with some variant of I'm a professor of philosophy. And the reason for that is because it has become a major part of my identity. That's not unusual for academics in general. I mean, but in my case, it's a little strange because, as you pointed out, I started out as a biologist, and I thought of myself as a scientist from literally when I was a kid. According to family lore, to my grandmother, I announced that I was going to be a scientist when I was like 5. Although initially, apparently, I was interested in astronomy, not biology. So I always thought of myself as a scientist and as an academic. And then several years ago, in the middle of a sort of midlife crisis, I decided to switch fields and go to philosophy. And I realized that this was definitely a good decision for me. Not that I regret anything that I've done in the sciences. I think my career in the sciences was great and very satisfactory. But philosophy really, at this stage in my life, really grabbed me. And so a philosopher, although it sounds like a little pretentious, is the way I would sort of introduce myself, even in a bar. But, and how that's going to go with people, that depends on what they think of philosophy.
Exactly right, because my follow-up question here was, have you done that? And what's the kind of response that you get usually once you say, well, I'm a professor in philosophy?
So I've done some variation of that. And typically, because when people meet you, one of the first things that they do ask you anyway is, so what do you do? And I'm a philosopher. Or sometimes if I want to soften the blow, I teach philosophy, because that's, it's a little bit less direct. They don't really know what to say because, first of all, most people don't have any idea of what a professional philosopher actually does. So I actually, in 2 or 3 cases, I've actually had people saying, so do you spend your time staring out into the void and thinking deep thoughts? And I said, no, that's actually, I spend a lot of time on my word processor thinking about deep thoughts. But and of course, I know from experience that a lot of people inwardly think something on the lines of, well, that's a waste of time. But they're usually too polite to say so.
Mm-hmm. Well, we'll come back to that, but and you already answered the question of whether you're first and foremost a scientist or a philosopher, because you do have 2 PhDs in science, genetics and evolutionary biology, and 1 in philosophy. So therefore, you should be 2/3 scientist and only 1/3 philosopher, at least by academically speaking.
Right. It doesn't actually work that way. Yeah, you're right. One would expect. I think of myself at this point as a full-time philosopher, although my specialty in philosophy is philosophy of science. So I do keep up with the scientific literature in my previous field, which was evolutionary biology, as you pointed out. So I typically think of myself as a combination of both. I mean, that was the point of moving to philosophy. It wasn't to abandon science. It was to expand my view of science, look at science from the outside in a sense.
So, but then share with us, if you may, that sort of midlife crisis that you were facing, that forced you to take that pretty radical change in your life, and even your outlook of life and the way you approach life, perhaps. And why is it that philosophy turned out to be sort of like a medicine for that midlife crisis, and maybe even, as the philosophers say, a medicine for the soul in general? Why would that be the
Right.
case? In your case particularly, but also in general?
So there were two aspects to my sort of crisis. It wasn't anything, particularly dramatic, but there were two aspects. One that most people probably can relate to, and the other one that most academics can relate to. So the academic crisis was, okay, I did my standard steps in an academic career, assistant professor, full professor, associate professor and full professor with tenure, blah, blah, blah. I was doing well. My laboratory was funded by the National Science Foundation. But then at some point I stopped and I said, so do I really want to keep going and doing this for another 30 years? And a lot of people, a lot of academics do ask themselves that question. What's unusual in my case is the answer. Most people say, oh, okay, well, let me retool myself. Let me spend a sabbatical learning something different. But they look at nearby fields. They don't look, as far as philosophy, literally on the other side of campus, basically. In the humanities, part of campus. In my case, that was the unusual part. And the reason for that is because I've always been interested in philosophy. And the reason for that is because in high school, when I was in Rome growing up, I had to take 3 years of philosophy. And my teacher was spectacular. I mean, she just, made the field come alive. And so I always had an interest in philosophy. And so for me, it was kind of a natural transition. In terms of the personal aspect of the life crisis, again, this is something that most people probably recognize. So I was in my early 40s, and in one particular year, I was hit by sort of a quadruple whammy. Nothing, as I said, particularly unusual, but my wife divorced me, my father died, I moved to a different city, got a new job. So each one of those four, taken in isolation, is enough to create a little bit of turmoil in anybody's life. All four of them happening within the span of a few months was a little heavy. That happened to be the time that I also had decided to go back to get my Ph.D. in philosophy. So I was studying philosophy. And so I figured, well, you're in the middle of a crisis, you're studying philosophy. I think that you should try to see whether philosophy is going to be helpful in this respect. Not academic philosophy, but philosophy as a broader field, as a broader art of living in a sense, right? And sure enough, that is where I found the answer. It took some time. The first thing that I realized was that whatever I was looking for in terms of a new framework, a new way of orienting myself in life, was probably going to come from an area called virtue ethics. Virtue ethics is about rebuilding your character, you improving your character, and becoming a better human being. And it is most famously associated with Aristotle's philosophy. So that's what I did. I started with Aristotle. Aristotle didn't quite do it for me, however, because first of all, he's a little too theoretical, and it doesn't actually give you any practical suggestions about how to live your life. It's the theory sounds interesting, but there's not much of it in the way of practice. And also, it's a little bit of an elitist. I mean, Aristotle says that the eudaimonic life, as the Greek called it, the life worth living, requires a focus on your character, focus on what the Greeks call virtue, or it stands translated today as virtue. The word is arete, which actually means excellence. So becoming a better, the best human being you can.
One of his daughters was also named Arete, if I remember.
Yeah, probably. Yeah, that's right. So the focus is on virtue, but it's also, Aristotle says, yeah, but you also need a bit of wealth, and you need education, and you need health, and you need good looks. And I said, okay, I'm screwed. That's not gonna happen. So it's a little bit elitist, which is not surprising, since Aristotle himself was an aristocrat. His father was the physician of the king of Macedon. So yeah. But it's interesting. It was interesting to go through the thing. And then the next stop was Epicurus. Epicurus got a lot of interesting things to say, including some practical suggestions about how to live your life. The problem with Epicurus is that for Epicureans, the highest goal in life is to live a life not as much of pleasure, but without pain. In fact, Epicurus defined the highest pleasure possible as absence of pain, particularly mental pain. And so it's like, okay, and how do I do that? And Epicurus says, well, one thing you want to avoid is social and political involvement, because that's painful. And, he's got a point. I mean, we can, if you just pay attention to the news, particularly the political section of the news, it's like, yeah, he was right. But I couldn't imagine a life without a social and political involvement, a meaningful life without a political social involvement. So Epicurus was out. And so at that point, what happened was that, so I was looking, and I was still saying, okay, well, it's got to be in this ballpark, more or less. And then I got this tweet, of all things, that said, help us celebrate Stoic Week. And I thought, what the hell is Stoic Week? And why would anybody want to celebrate the Stoics? And then I realized, it's like, wait a minute, the Stoicism also is a type of virtue ethics. And of course, I had read Marcus Aurelius when I was in college. And in fact, in high school, I even translated Seneca from Latin. But I never put the two together. I never actually sort of thought about these people actually belonging to the same general sort of philosophy. So I said, let's sign up. So I signed up for Stoic Week, which happens every year. It's about to happen in this year. I think it's in October. And basically what it is you download a bunch of, material about the Stoics, basic information about the history and philosophy of Stoicism. You start reading Stoic texts, and then you start practicing. There's practical exercises that you go through. And at the end of the week, I thought that the whole thing really was clicking very well. So it was worth, sticking with the practice for another couple of months. And then after that, I said, okay, this is actually really helping me out, and I'm going to stick for another year. And then now here we are, almost 6 years later, I'm still talking about it.
And by the way, I want to recommend to all of our listeners and viewers today to check out StoiCon, which is a fantastic annual conference. And you probably don't even remember, but we actually met a couple of years ago at the StoiCon conference here in Toronto, Canada.
You did
very briefly. Yeah, you had a fantastic presentation. And of course, many people came to talk to you and shake your hand. So it's okay. You don't remember, but
yes, these days, which we couldn't do these days, right?
But hopefully we'll be able to do it soon enough. Maybe. Yeah.
Well, I know the StoiCon this year, which is supposed to be in Toronto, is actually going to go entirely online. It's going to be in October. And then StoiCon 2021 is going to be physical, hopefully, in Toronto.
Right. And so that may be another occasion for us to meet each other again in person. But give us a little more about what's Stoicism and how is that distinguished from general philosophy? Because people are very confused about what particularly Stoicism means. And we have this kind of popular perception of it, which, as you often say in your presentation, is not actually what Stoicism is about.
Right. The word Stoic with a little s in modern English refers to somebody who tries to live their life with stiff upper lip and suppressing emotions, which is in fact a distortion of the philosophy of Stoicism. As every distortion or stereotype, there is a grain of truth there. Maybe we're going to get there, but it is a distortion. So Stoicism is a Greek and Roman philosophy. It originated around 300 BC in Athens. And I often present it as kind of the Western equivalent of Buddhism, because, in fact, the two philosophies have a lot in common in terms of ethics, in terms of how to behave in life. Their metaphysics are very different. Their view of the world is very different, but their ethics actually is very convergent. And basically, the goal of a Stoic life is to, as I said before, to become a better human being. And you do that by practicing a number of exercises regularly, and by being mindful. The word that the Stoics use is prosoke, which means paying attention, basically. So by paying attention, by being mindful about what to do, you do every day in terms of the ethical balance of what you do, the ethical import of what you do. And there's a couple of ways of actually doing this in practice. One of them, arguably the most important or certainly most efficacious for people who just start practicing, is the so-called dichotomy of control. The dichotomy of control goes back to Epictetus, who was a late 1st century, early 2nd century Stoic philosopher who greatly influenced the emperor Marcus Aurelius. And Epictetus says at the beginning of the Enchiridion, which is his manual for a good life, he says some things are up to you and other things are not up to you. And then he lists some things that actually are you control and other things you don't control. And then it tells you that a good life is made of focusing on the first bit and taking the rest as it comes, developing an attitude of equanimity toward outcomes. In modern terms, modern terminology, that basically corresponds to internalizing your goals. So, for instance, if I were to go for a job interview tomorrow morning, it comes natural to us to focus on the outcome, right? I want the job. I want the interview to go well and all this. But the outcome is not up to you, meaning that you can obviously influence it, right? The outcome does in part depend on how you actually do the interview, but ultimately this is not your decision. The buck doesn't stop with you. The buck stops with whoever is interviewing you, right? And it depends on other factors. It depends on who is doing the interview, what mood the person is when he's doing the interview, what competition you have from other people who don't know, et cetera, right? So you can do the best that you can, but ultimately the outcome is not up to you. However, the dichotomy of control tells you, right, so focus on the bit that is up to you, and that is preparing the best you can, being focused in the interview, dress appropriately, put together the best resume, et cetera, and then prepare yourself mentally to say, look, I'm an adult. I understand that in life sometimes things go your way and sometimes they don't. And if they do, I'll appreciate the fact that in part this is the result of my efforts, but in part is luck. It could have easily gone the other way. And if they don't go my way, I'm not a child anymore. I'm not going to throw a tantrum. I'm going to pick up my stuff and go for another interview next week or the week after. So that's the basic idea. I mean, there's obviously a lot more to be said about it, but that's the essential part.
One of my favorite words that you use there while describing Stoicism is also, for good or for bad, I think unfortunately a word that scares a lot of people. So I'd like you to describe or unpack that word for us too, and that's ethics. What is ethics?
That's a great question. So if you ask a modern moral philosopher, so professionals who actually do ethics, essentially, I'm going to use the word ethics and morality interchangeably. Some people make a distinction there,
yes.
But in fact, the two words actually have a similar root. The word ethics comes from the Greek ethikos, and the word morality comes from the Latin moralis, which is how Cicero translated the Greek ethikos. So originally, at least, they meant exactly the same thing, and so I'm not going to make any distinction there. I'm going to treat them the same. However, if you're talking about ethics or morality from a modern perspective, the emphasis is on whether an action is right or wrong. So an ethicist, if you write, for instance, to the New York Times when they had their ethicist column, the question typically was, well, I'm about to do this. Do you think it's right or do you think it's wrong? Right? That's the typical thing. And there are several frameworks that are used by modern ethicists to answer that question. You could be a utilitarian and look at the maximizing most people happiness and minimizing people's pains, or you can be a deontologist and so following rules, that sort of stuff. However, in the ancient world, the word ethics was understood far more broadly. Ethics literally was the study of how to live your life. Now, living your life implies that you're also going to try to make the right judgment and do the right thing, obviously. But that's only a part of it. It also includes, what kind of activities should I pursue? What should be my goals in life? How should I treat people including my relatives, my friends, and so on and so forth. So ethics was far broader, and I really like the ancient conception of ethics for that reason. So for all effective purposes, during this conversation, ethics means literally the study of how to live your life.
Yeah, and I love how you define that, which of course is no surprise to anyone who's been following me for the last 10 years, because Socrates is my all-time most favorite guy.
Right.
And of course, I was called Socrates when I was in the army, which was a sort of a nickname which I initially resisted for a while, and then eventually I was like, well, if you can't fight it, you might as well accept it.
And besides, as far as nicknames go, that is a lot worse. Especially in the army.
That's a great point, especially in the army. It goes a lot worse than Socrates, even though at the time that was derogatory, by the way.
Yeah, I can imagine.
So, but still, there is a lot worse. So some of the things or the pushback that I get from people when I talk to them about ethics is one of the first things that they tell me is that ethics is totally subjective. What do you tell people about that when someone says, well, you can have any rules that you want and you can come up with anything and, you believe whatever you want to believe and there's not right and wrong, and how can you tell me what's right and wrong if I believe that my right and wrong is different than your right and wrong? And, how do you address that?
Bunch of relativists. I've noticed that a lot of my students also tend to answer that way, that question. I think that those people are either lying or they're fooling themselves. More likely they're fooling themselves. And the reason I'm saying that...
Or it's the easy way out, I think.
Yeah, it is an easy way out. But the reason I'm saying that they're fooling themselves or just being inconsistent is that when it comes to something that is done to them, they become outraged. So if somebody steals from them or somebody does... that hurts them somehow, they immediately start saying, well, that's not right.
Yes.
Well, wait a minute. I thought that right and
subjective,
wrong was
right?
subjective. So what are you talking about? I think that a moral relativist is simply an inconsistent person. He's confused about ethics and is inconsistent. By the way, a lot of my colleagues, a good number of my colleagues are relativists. But I'm not going to change. This may sound like a strong judgment, but I'm absolutely convinced. I talked to a lot of relativists, including some professional philosophers who consider themselves relativists. And I find the position to be completely inconsistent. However, at the opposite end of that spectrum is another position that I also
Sam
find
Harris, the scientists kind of like...
Yes, the scientist or the person who says that somehow morality is not only objective, but mind independent. Kant was...
Or quantifiable in some way or another.
Quantifiable, but also the important thing here is, so these are called realists, as opposed to the ones that we were talking about before in philosophy are relativists.
Yeah.
The one I'm talking about now, Kant is the best example probably, are moral realists, meaning that they think that not only morality is objective, but there are moral truths out there that we can discover in a sense, right? We don't invent them. We don't invent morality. We don't construct morality. We just we discover it. And Kant was the most famous example. I mean, that's also pretty crazy, because what do you mean out there? What do you mean that morality is mind independent? If there were no human beings, there would be no morality on Earth, at least. So my position is intermediate, and it's in fact I call it quasi-realism, or more aptly probably naturalism. It's a naturalistic ethics, and that is the approach that the Stoics have as well. And although I actually I moved toward a naturalistic approach to ethics even before I discovered Stoicism. So that was just a bonus once I figured out that the Stoics also are naturalists about ethics. And what does it mean to be naturalist about ethics? It means that obviously ethics is a historical human construct. It doesn't exist out there in any meaningful sense. However, it is not an arbitrary construct. And the reason for that is because ethics, as I said, it's about living in a society, right? Interacting with others. In fact, the word ethikos that I mentioned earlier, from which the English term comes, literally meant originally interacting with others, community with others, right? So the point of ethics, in a sense, is to tell you how you should behave related to other human beings, right? Now, these relations, these interactions are not arbitrary because they are constrained by human biology. we are a species of social primates that evolved in a particular way. We are highly social. We're much more social than any other primate, arguably much more social than any other species on Earth, except for social insects. But unlike social insects, we also have another little thing that is important. There's the ability to reason about things, to make decisions about things, which social insects don't. That's why the Stoics came up with this famous motto that kind of surprises people. And they said that we should live according to nature. And so when you hear the first time, it's like, what does that mean? Should I go strip myself naked and run into the forest and hug trees? No, you shouldn't. Well, maybe you should, but that's not what they meant. What they did mean was that we should live a life that takes into consideration, takes seriously what it means to be a human being. And for them, to be a human being means chiefly two things: high degree of sociality and the ability to reason about things, to solve problems by reasoning about it. So what they meant by their entire ethics is built on this notion that we should basically use our reason to improve social living, to improve relations with other people.
Yeah, and you kind of preempted here my following question, because it is kind of like the backbone or the cornerstone of that ethics, and that's the definition of being human. Can you perhaps reiterate that, because it's crucially important, because if someone denies your definition, then they're able perhaps to deny your ethics.
Of course. And in fact, some of the ancients themselves disagree with the Stoics. So let me give you an example. So first of all, let me back up for a second. As I said, it is a naturalistic philosophy because the ethics is grounded in human nature. But of course, there's a number of aspects about human nature. There are other things that come natural to human beings. For instance, violence or xenophobia or anything like that. Those are natural attributes of humanity, unfortunately. And so one could say, well, why don't you focus on those instead? And so why don't you go around saying that we should be xenophobic and violent rather than reasonable and social? Right? And the Stoics' response to that is, it says that, look, sure, those components are there, but we're not saying that everything that is natural is good, because that would be a logical fallacy. That's called an appeal to nature. And the Stoics were very good logicians. So they knew better than engage in a logical fallacy. I mean, it's pretty clear that we shouldn't do just whatever comes natural, because there are lots of things that are natural and they're not good for you. I don't know, poisonous mushrooms come to mind, for instance. And there are all sorts of things that are not natural and they're nevertheless good. Like we're talking through, I'm using an iPad here to talk to you, and that's certainly a non-natural thing. You don't find it in the middle of the forest, and yet it's useful. It's something. So clearly, they don't mean that whatever is natural is good, or vice versa. So what they mean is that in their mind, the most basic aspects, the most crucial, the most fundamental aspects of human nature are our ability to reason and our ability to live socially. Now, they made an argument for this. They didn't just state it. They made an argument. The argument is called the cradle argument. The cradle argument goes like this. If you observe human infants very carefully, you'll find that they, first of all, the first thing they do naturally, instinctively, without anybody having to teach them, is to look after themselves. They try to protect themselves, their bodily integrity. They're trying to be safe for themselves. And then immediately they realize, again instinctively, they don't without thinking about it, that in order to do that, they need to depend and be paying attention to their caretakers. They are, in other words, they immediately expand their circle of concern to at least their parents and probably their siblings and things like that. And then if you follow human developmental psychology, a few years later, we hit the age of reason. That's about between 7 to 9 years old. That's when we begin to be able to formulate abstract concepts. And as soon as you do that, then you realize that, wait a minute, if it's good for me to interact positively with other people in immediate surroundings, then it's probably good for me to do that with anybody whenever possible, because we're cooperating in each other. In other words, a cooperation is far more conducive to my own flourishing than conflict, than strife, and things like that. So that's the cradle argument. Now, as you pointed out, other philosophy might disagree. For instance, the Epicureans also used a cradle argument, and they said, well, as it turns out, the first thing you observe in human infants is that they seek pleasure and avoid pain, right? Which, of course, is the foundation of Epicurean philosophy. Now, the Stoics had a response to that, and they said, well, not exactly. Yes, they do. I mean, according to the Stoics also, seeking pleasure is, in fact, according to nature, and avoiding pain is also according to nature. That's for sure. But they said that it's secondary because human infants clearly engage in behaviors that are not pleasurable and sometimes even painful if it is good for their well-being. For instance, they struggle to very early on to learn how to walk, and learning how to walk is painful because you fall, you keep falling, and you hurt yourself and things like that. And yet, nevertheless, they keep doing it. Right. So clearly, according to the Stoics, pleasure and pain are important, yes, but they're not fundamental. And so that's the way these kinds of discussions go. You're absolutely right. Somebody could look at human nature and say, no, I have a different opinion about human nature. However, there is a little thing called science these days, which the ancients didn't have, right? And I'm a biologist, as you pointed out, so I do pay attention to the science, particularly to the interaction between science and philosophy. You mentioned Sam Harris, and one of my major disagreements with Harris is that he reads too much into the science and too little into the philosophy. He doesn't seem to, for instance, to realize that he actually starts his famous book, The Moral Landscape, starts out by assuming a particular philosophy, a particular moral philosophy, utilitarianism, without any justification whatsoever. So he actually gets the philosophy on board without even thinking about it. And on the one hand, and on the other hand, he seems to say that you can straightforwardly read ethics from facts, and therefore the science is the answer. I think it's a little bit more complicated than that. As I just showed you with the disagreement between Epicureans and Stoics, you can't read things straight from the facts. You have to interpret the facts, you have to make certain choices, and there may be more than one reasonable way to look at the same exact facts from an ethical perspective.
That's what makes ethics so much harder, in my opinion, than science, actually, because it's not so easy to get straight, especially let alone quantifiable answers from the facts that have ethical implications. There's so much interpretation, there's so much goal orientation, there's so much context that you need to import that ethics becomes, in my opinion, so much more tricky and complicated than science.
Absolutely.
Yeah, go ahead.
So the point, however, is that there is a science that is relevant. So you don't ever want to do philosophy by ignoring the science, because that's a bad recipe for doing philosophy. So what I'm saying is, on the one hand, yes, Harris is wrong. I think that you can replace philosophy with science, but on the other hand, some of my colleagues are also incorrect when they say, "Oh, science is just about facts. We're doing something different." No, we're not. We are thinking about facts. So we do need to get the facts straight. And modern science clearly tells you that the Stoics, I think, were pretty close to a reasonable understanding of human nature. Both studies in comparative primatology and comparative anthropology confirm that, in fact, human beings are fundamentally pro-social. Yes, we also have a selfish aspect to ourselves. Yes, we also have violence, xenophobia, and a bunch of other things. But foundationally, we are social animals. How do we know? Well, because we have pro-social instincts, just like other social primates. There are other social primates that are closely related to us, like the bonobos, chimpanzees, for instance, that seem to have this instinct for a behavior that a scientist would call pro-social and a philosopher would say is ethical. They try to help each other, even when they're not relatives, but they're trying to help each other within the same, the social group. They're trying to diffuse conflict when it arises, things like that. And we have the same instincts. We have the same basically pro-social instincts. And then what philosophy does is it builds on those instincts. Those instincts evolved, hundreds of thousands of years ago, if not millions of years ago. So they're good as a starting point. When you have that gut feeling that something is unjust or something is just, that's your instinctual reaction. But your instinctual reaction is just not enough, because we live in a society that's far more complicated than anything that has occurred in human history, where there are lots more variables at play. There are a lot more interactions with other people. And that is why your instincts are a good beginning, a good starting point, but they're definitely not the end of it. You need to actually use your reason to arrive at better and better solutions, which is exactly what the Stoics were saying. Use your reason to improve social living.
So, Massimo, we are past the halfway point, and I wanted to take this time. In fact, if I had the chance, I would have taken a little more time to sort of lay out the groundwork, the foundational, maybe epistemological foundation of ethics before we go into the second part of our conversation, which is how and if or how we can take that ethics and hopefully apply it to what you just called our very complicated and advanced civilization, our very complicated and demanding life today in the 21st century, and if that's possible at all. And of course, all my audience already knows that I'm very pre-biased in that, because my whole work for the last 10 years has been summarized by the thesis that technology is not enough, that we need something else, something more. And in my claim, it's always been the case that is ethics. Now, let me ask you this. So there's a few ways we can approach this, but let me ask you first this at the macro picture. What, in your view, are the biggest issues that humanity is facing today?
Oh, that is a great question. Well, there's two or three that are obvious that come to mind, and I'm going to just list them in random order, not necessarily because one is more crucial than the other.
Sure.
Obviously, we're dealing with the very real possibility at this point of serious climate collapse over the next several decades. That would be an unprecedented kind of crisis in human history. So we need to deal with it. I know that some people keep still, putting their head in the sand about this, but the science in my mind is very clear, and it has been clear for decades at this point. It's not like, there was a time where it wasn't clear. There was a time when it was reasonable to be skeptical and open-minded about these kind of things, but right, that time is long past. And
as an interesting side note, I was reading that there was a woman from New York State who in 1857, actually, she was studying in a college in New York State. And in 1857, she did a conceptual, first theoretical, and then an experimental proof of global warming. And she did like a sphere with a couple of gases and how, under certain condition, you have a global warming effect. First of all, they refused to publish her paper because she was a woman.
Of course.
Secondly, after many years and many tries, they did publish her paper. They refused her the chance to actually present her paper to a bunch of scientists like a few years later to a few meetings. So I was shocked to discover that the first, at least theoretical or experimental proof that we could be facing global warming one day comes from like second half of the 19th century, like 1860s or 70s.
Right. So the writing was on the wall. And at this point, if you don't see it, you're just blind, either because of ideological reasons or because of ignorance, but you're just blind. So that's one challenge. The second one, I think that the second challenge that we're facing is to find out somehow a better way to get along with each other. The 20th century, as you know, was characterized by not one, but two world wars. Fortunately, we haven't had another one since, but we have had a number of conflicts, either hot conflicts or cold conflicts. And that is something that's got to go. Because as the Stoics recognized already 2,300 years ago, we live in a cosmopolis. We live in a world that is highly interconnected. It was highly interconnected at the time, let alone now that we live in an age of globalization, fast travel, and things like that. And the pandemic is to show you just how interconnected it is, right? This virus, the pandemic, is occurring in part because it is so damn easy for people to get around on this planet, which is a great thing. It's a wonderful thing. I mean, I love traveling and all that sort of stuff, but it does come with these kinds of consequences. So I think that some better way of coordinating things, efforts, and some better, more cooperative at the global level effort to improve things and to make the world a better place needs to be articulated. Now, we tried, of course, a couple of things after World War I, particularly after the two world wars. After World War I, there was the League of Nations, which was originated by the Americans, by the American president at the time, and
Wilson.
Right, and that failed. And one of the reasons it failed is because Wilson, understandably perhaps, wanted to keep the club limited to democracies. And of course, especially at the time, that excluded like 2/3 of the world. So you're not going to have a League of Nations that is going to be particularly effective if you just ignore 2/3 of the world. After World War II, of course, we have the United Nations. And the United Nations has actually worked. I know that they have a mixed reputation, and deservedly so, but it has actually worked toward exactly that goal, toward reducing conflict, to be helpful across the globe.
The specific goal of the United Nations from the get-go was not to create heaven on earth, but it was to avoid hell, the nuclear Armageddon that we were scared of happening between the two superpowers of the world. Exactly. And so with respect to its actual goal, it has succeeded very well of diffusing attentions. And yes, we got very close a couple of times, but with the help of the United Nations, we have been able to avoid that. So in that sense, it's been very successful. We haven't had a nuclear war, despite all its problems.
That's right. And it has done a lot of humanitarian work and a lot of diplomatic work that wouldn't be possible without the United Nations. Now, of course, as we all know, the United Nations also has structural problems. For instance, there is the most obvious of which is that there is a permanent Security Council. That means that a small number of nations that just happen to be the ones that won World War II are basically in charge of everything. And that's
veto powers.
With the power. That's not a sustainable model. And in fact, I would argue that a lot of the problems that UN has run into are exactly the result of that particular structure. Now, I don't know what the next stage is going to be, but I do think we need a next stage. It could simply be a reformed United Nations that work in some kind of different way, or it could be a completely different organization. I have no idea. But I do think that in terms of challenges, that is, international cooperation is a challenge. The third challenge that I think we need to keep in mind is this, that we live in an almost unprecedented age of inequality in the world. It's true, as people like Steven Pinker keep saying, that things have gotten better and better. Yes, that's correct. I mean, just do the following thought experiment, right? If you had a choice of any other place or time to live on Earth or during the history of humanity, what would you choose? I would probably choose a Western country or some Eastern countries in the 21st century, like Japan, for instance, or Korea. That's it. I mean, I wouldn't go back to the Middle Ages. I wouldn't go back even to the Renaissance or to the Roman Empire or anything like that, because they were pretty damn hard places and time to live. So it is certainly true that we made progress. At the same time, we're also facing unprecedented challenges like the ones that I just mentioned. And it is certainly the case that the degree of inequality and in this moment, especially not only among Western societies actually, is actually at the same level as the one that we had during the Roman Empire. And the Roman Empire was the most unequal society in the history of humanity. I mean, it had slavery, so it couldn't, So I think that is something to deal with. And because it's not that I'm not particularly concerned with inequality per se. I think actually I follow a modern philosopher on this, John Rawls, who argued that a certain degree of inequality is not only inevitable, but it's actually probably good. Because
but then you have to have the veil of ignorance.
Right, you have to have the famous veil of ignorance. Well, that's which means you want to build a society where there is no built-in privilege for anybody, that you don't know whether you're going to get the privilege.
One cuts and the other chooses.
That's right, exactly. So some degree of inequality, I think I agree with Rawls, is not only inevitable, but actually structurally good, but not the level we have now. The level that we have now means that our political system is corrupt because for all effective purposes, especially here in the United States, our politicians are basically in the pockets, by and large, of large corporations and of billionaires. That's not acceptable. That's not a democracy. We also have a situation where we live in the richest country, one of the richest countries in the world, and one of the most technological countries in the world, and yet we can't find masks, cheap masks in the middle of a pandemic. We can't find ventilators to help people when they get to the hospital. That's just not acceptable. We have a system where healthcare is tied to the place of employment, which means that in a situation like this, where millions of people are losing their job, they're also, on top of that, losing their healthcare. And of course, there is no safety net. So it's a disaster. I mean, the pandemics, if anything, has clearly put the spotlight on what are structural problems, not just leadership problems. Because we can criticize the president all we want, and I certainly do. But it's not like I was just reading an article the other day by somebody who pointed out correctly that it's not like if magically we could replace Trump with Biden or even Obama or whatever, that all of a sudden things will go well. Some things will go well for sure.
Obama did nothing, honestly, like
well,
nothing.
At least he did put in place.
Maybe he didn't do so much damage and destroy the reputation, and didn't do stupid stuff like telling people to inject, bleach or disinfectant or something. But he did nothing really like substantial.
No, I agree. It did little of substance. And so if somebody better, much better even than Trump were in charge now, yes, there would be some advantages, as you pointed out. They wouldn't be giving random and possibly lethal medical advice to people and things like that. But the structural problems will still be there. We still would have millions of people without a safety net, without health insurance, and so on and so forth. And nobody can solve this by magic. This requires some kind of structural rethinking of the foundations of our society. So I think these are the major challenges we're facing in international cooperation, inequality, and climate change.
Mm-hmm. You know, when I go to speak around the world, I sometimes give one of the keynotes I give on is called "Technology is the how, not the why or the what."
Right.
And I often talk about California, which is the golden state, supposedly, and how at least a quarter, maybe more than a quarter of the population there live at or below the poverty line. How they have the largest conglomeration of billionaire, now $1 trillion approaching companies in some cases, private billionaires, capital, technology, and educated people. And at the same time, if you compare California to places such as Canada or the Nordic countries, which have less capital, less technology, and less perhaps amazing educational institutions such as Stanford and so on.
Right.
Yet we still, for example, Canadians live almost 4 years longer than Americans on average. Mm-hmm. We have much less crime. We have much more security, much more safety, much fewer victims from COVID-19 currently, etc., etc. So my point is that you can have all the technology, all the money in the world, but if structurally it's not applied properly, you would end up still having a society which is literally at the precipice of a collapse, it seems to me right now.
I agree. I think that the way I often put something like the point that you're making is that if we start counting from, let's say, the age, the golden age of ancient Greece, so 24 centuries ago, okay?
Right.
The age of Pericles. If we start counting from that point on, and the reason I'm suggesting that is because we have a good historical record. If you go further back, then it becomes a little bit foggy what actually was happening. Yeah. But from that point on, we have had, of course, a enormous amount of technological progress and increase in knowledge. Right? Knowledge and technology have increased, especially, of course, over the last 200 or 300 years.
And wealth, too.
Right, and wealth as a result of that.
Yes.
What has not increased at all, almost, is wisdom.
Yeah, exactly.
We have the same small number of people who keep telling us, this is not a good idea, and most of us keep ignoring it because we lack wisdom. We actually suffer from a condition that the Greeks had a word for. The word for it was amatia, A-M-A-T-H-I-A, which literally means unwisdom.
Yeah.
And there's this beautiful dialogue, Platonic dialogue, called the Major Alcibiades, where Socrates is talking to his friend, student, and apparently also lover, Alcibiades.
Platonic lover, not physical lover, platonic
that we know
lover.
of, right? Although it was not unusual at all not to go platonic in that case.
Yeah, but they're talking about how their shoulders were burning when they rubbed shoulders with each other, so they actually never consumed it. And Alcibiades pushed Socrates on multiple occasions and was denied, and he was very pissed off about that.
That's right. It wasn't one way.
So it's important to say that it was one way, and Socrates said he loves him too, but he never responded to his advances, so it was platonic.
Right, but the important point here is that we're having this conversation in the Platonic dialogue between Socrates, his mentor basically, Socrates, and Alcibiades. Now Alcibiades, at least some of your listeners probably know, but he became a general in Athens. He played a major role in the Peloponnesian War, and it was a disastrous role. He was the one that convinced Athens, for instance, or pushed for Athens to invade Sicily, which turned out to be the turning point of the war against the Athenians, and it was a disaster. On top of which, he was incredibly flamboyant kind of character. He was an Athenian general, then he defected to Sparta, and then he defected to the Persians, and then went back to the Athenians. It's just like a mess. It's a really interesting figure. Now, the dialogue between Socrates and Alcibiades at some point reaches this point where Alcibiades is clearly asking Socrates for guidance. Okay? He's a young Alcibiades. He's already a brushed young man, but he's still asking for guidance. And Socrates says, here's the problem with people like you. And by that, he means people that are interested in politics, people that want to go into politics. He says, the problem is you have enthusiasm, you have energy, but you lack wisdom. And you're going to cause a lot of trouble for a lot of people. The situation has not changed at all, as far as I can tell, in the intervening 23, 24 centuries. We still have essentially the same thing. I'm actually writing a book now, in the middle of writing a book on the relationship between Socrates and Alcibiades. And as part of the background for that book, I am reading from beginning to end, rereading the Thucydides' history of the Peloponnesian War.
Yeah.
And one of the amazing things about that book is that Thucydides reports several people, including himself, but several people who had warned the Athenians of where the thing was going. Thucydides himself was actually an Athenian general before he was kicked out. Right? Yeah. But then he says, I warned my colleagues and fellow citizens. The playwrights did this well. There were several playwrights alive at the time, Aristophanes, for instance, Euripides. They all warned of where this thing was going. Some of the philosophers, including Socrates, warned where this thing was going. Did people listen? No. And we have exactly the same situation today. So we have this bizarre situation where wisdom is accessible, obviously, because some people, at any particular age, and any particular time, some people actually can understand. They have the wisdom to understand where things are going and to warn the rest of us that we shouldn't go that way. Unfortunately, however, the rest of us are much more enamored of knowledge and technology and all that sort of that stuff, and not wisdom, and therefore we ignore, to our own peril, what these people are telling us. Yeah,
I forget what poet was it that said that human nature has not much changed for the past 10,000 years than, right, let's say, the beaks of eagles. Yes. So we have basically stayed at that level, and actually that's why I often say that we don't have things like climate change, nuclear war, or what else have you, as a differentiating things, but rather they're all one and the same thing, and that is simply our technological power or prowess, far surpassing our wisdom of applying it in a productive, safe, and wise way, if you will. But basically, we're kind of giving it sort of almost free rein, and
right. And that's one of the reasons why I tend to be skeptical of what I call techno-optimists. I have a friend who is a techno-optimist. So basically, these are people who think that the solution to our problems, of course, will come from technology. Well, I'm a scientist. I certainly don't discard technology. In fact, I'm an early adopter usually of technologies. I just told you I'm talking to you through an iPad Pro and all that sort of stuff, right? So it's not that I'm against technology. I'm not a Luddite or anything like that. But I tend to be skeptical precisely because of what you just said, that there is a disconnect between the technological advancement and wisdom. And we tend to forget, people who are techno-optimists tend to forget that technology itself is what created the problem in the first place. Like, climate change wouldn't exist if we didn't have the Industrial Revolution. That was a technological advancement. Wonderful in a number of different ways. But nevertheless, when not accompanied by wisdom, here we are. Only less than 150 years after the beginning of the Industrial Revolution, here we are, we're destroying the planet. That's pretty damn fast. That's pretty damn efficient, right?
Well, people would say the Industrial Revolution was more like 1670s with the Watt engine and stuff like that starting.
Sure.
But those are just details. Yeah.
Yeah, even so,
150,
even if you want to do it,
250, it doesn't matter. But we're getting here to the crux of our conversation. And unfortunately, I'm kind of getting a little stressed that we're running out of time. And this is where the interesting part of the conversation actually begins. But unfortunately, we had to lay out all this foundation to even get to the meat of the matter here. And because you see, some of the most famous techno-solutionists or techno-optimists right now are people such as Ray Kurzweil and Peter Diamandis and so on and so on. So Peter, for example, famously told us that we're going to live in a world of abundance and the future is better than we think. And Ray Kurzweil has told us that the singularity is near. So let me shift our conversation here to the meat of the matter and ask you, what's your take on the technological singularity?
I don't think it's going to happen. And certainly it's not going to happen within the time frame that Kurzweil is talking about. You might notice that both of the people that you're talking about, if you ask them, well, when is this going to happen? It's usually 3 or 4 decades down the road, which is just enough for them to be dead and not be caught into oh, hey, it turned out you were wrong. In fact, these kind of prophecies, to me, technological prophecies, to me, actually bear a strong resemblance to religious prophecies. There's, the Jehovah Witnesses, which of course is a sort of evangelical fundamentalist religious sect, right? They used to be in the business of predicting the end of the world, specifically, as in, this year is going to be the end of the world, right? They did that several times.
After multiple times, they changed their tune.
They stopped. They say, okay, well, it's going to come. It's coming soon, but now we're not going to tell you anymore, when that's going to happen. Now, I'm being partly facetious, but the point is serious. For one thing, and this would take probably a whole different conversation, maybe for another time, I actually think that Kurzweil underestimates a fundamental problem in terms of singularity, especially when we're talking about one aspect of the singularity, which is supposed to be, or one response to singularity, which is supposed to be mind uploading. So the way we're overcoming this is by uploading our minds to computers. I don't think that's going to happen. And the reason I don't think that's going to happen is because minds are the result of physical activities of a very particular kind. The computer analogy between the consciousness and the computer is, in fact, misleading. And several people now have been pointing out that this analogy has led a lot of research down a rabbit hole without making that much progress. It's certainly true that there are computational aspects to what the human mind does. It also depends on how you define computation, for one thing, because you can define computation broadly enough that basically everything becomes computational. But then at that point, the word kind of loses meaning.
So you think that the mind is strata dependent then?
Yes, I think that the mind is substrate dependent. Now, that doesn't mean that there's only one possible substrate that can support consciousness. Oh, by the way, often we've talked about artificial intelligence, but often people actually mean interchangeably artificial intelligence and artificial consciousness. They are not at all the same thing. Computers are already very intelligent, depending on how you define intelligence. If the intelligence you mean the ability to retrieve to large amount of data, to process large amount of data, to solve problems in specific domains and all that sort of stuff, then computers are already very intelligent and they will keep going in that direction. I don't see any sign of computer consciousness, however, at the moment. I am not suggesting that it's impossible because, first of all, because that's usually a bad bet. Whenever somebody says this is impossible, then it's going to happen the following day and you look like a fool.
One of Arthur C. Clarke's laws.
Exactly. Well, one of my favorite examples actually is an astronomer, I forgot his name, but an astronomer who in 1957, the date is important, confidently declared that human beings would never be able to put an artificial satellite in orbit around Earth. 2 months later, Sputnik goes up. So that's a classic example of somebody saying, oh, it's never going to happen.
And there's hundreds of those examples.
Exactly. So I do think, I'm not a mystic. I do think that consciousness is grounded in physical reality. And so as such, yes, we might be able to build artificial consciousness at some point or another. The question is, what are the prerequisites? And human consciousness is clearly connected to the wetware of the brain. It's a result of evolution. And it's not just a bunch of information processing. There's a lot of stuff going on there. There's a lot of specific chemical interactions that have to go on in order for us to be conscious. Is it replicable in an artificial object? Of course, in principle, yes. Is it going to happen with silicon? I don't know. I don't think anybody knows. What I'm saying is that I'm very skeptical of people that are so confident that obviously it's going to happen. Incidentally, when people talk about silicon and its chemical properties, I'm reminded of an argument that was made all the way back by Carl Sagan, one of my favorite role model in science. He did explore, from the point of view of exobiology, the possibility that we might encounter silicon-based life, and he was very skeptical of it. And the reason for that is because he realized, he knew enough chemistry. He realized that carbon is very unusual. The ability of carbon to create complex structures and interact with a number of elements is in fact unmatched in the entire periodic table. Silicon comes closest, but the chemical flexibility of silicon is far reduced compared to carbon. So when people so confidently say, oh, of course, we can do it with carbon, nature did it with carbon, we can do it with silicon, I say, well, slow down. This is not at all a foregone conclusion.
Well, but that's an argument of saying it's highly improbable, but it's not conclusive that it's impossible, right? So you're saying carbon
Correct.
is much more probable than silicon. Therefore, the chances of silicon are much less, but that doesn't mean there's zero.
No, it doesn't mean that there's zero. Although that doesn't mean, I don't have currently an argument to show that it is impossible, but it's very possible, so to speak, that at some point we might realize that, oh yeah, as it turns out, silicon is just too restricted in terms of flexibility, and it's not going to happen. What I'm saying is, I see a lot of people, smart people, including Kurzweil, who are so damn confident that this thing is not only going to happen, but it's going to happen very soon. Then I'm going to say, whoa, slow down. You really have no reason to be that confident. Particularly because the main argument
he has a very, very famous graph with exponential growth on it, going from the 1890s, the first, census in the United States, going through vacuum tubes, microprocessors, etc. And
but there are two major arguments against that graph. One is, of course, what he's doing is extrapolating a curve based on past experience. Any statistician will tell you that's an incredibly dangerous thing to do because you have no guarantee that the curve is going to keep going that way. I can show you, for instance, in biology, we're experiencing right now. We are in the middle of a pandemic. The virus has been growing exponentially, right?
For sure.
Now, we all knew, however, that at some point, the exponential growth was going to stop. It had to. No matter what we did, hopefully it's going to stop earlier because of social distancing and all the measures we're taking. But at some point, it had to stop, for the simple reason that the number of victims is limited. It's finite. So it would go into what is called a sigmoidal curve, which is well studied in biology. We know that's exactly what happens with bacterial infections, viral infections, and so on and so forth, or even any kind of population growth. At some point, you hit what biologists call the carrying capacity of the environment, and that's it. The curve flattens, and then eventually, in fact, it crashes. Kurzweil or nobody else has any idea of how that curve is going to continue. That's one possible extrapolation, but it makes a large number of assumptions about what's going to happen in the future. Also, back to the point that I made a few minutes ago, that curve is about computational ability, not consciousness. Consciousness doesn't come anywhere in that curve. We don't have a curve for consciousness because it would have to be a biological curve, and we don't have it, and it's measured in millions of years, not in decades. So for all those reasons, I tend to be fairly skeptical, either that this thing is going to happen, period, but certainly that it's going to happen anytime soon. And one of the things that worries me, to some extent, this is disagreement without consequence. It's like, okay, well, we'll see. But there are some consequences practical consequences, because there are some people actually, including Kurzweil, who are suggesting that this is a major problem that we should invest a lot of resources into this thing. And if it turns out to be a known problem because it's not going to happen, or it's not going to happen in the time frame that they're talking about, then resources are limited. Whatever we take away from something to divert to a new problem, it's going to have practical effects. There was a reason why, when you asked me, what do you think are the major challenges that we're facing in the near future, as you noted, singularity wasn't one of those. Because I'm seriously not worried that that's going to be a problem. If I were to put a fourth one to the three that I already mentioned, I would say some kind of extraterrestrial impact from a wandering asteroid. That is more likely in my mind than a singularity. Again, that doesn't mean that computers are not going to get smarter and smarter depending on how you define intelligence. They definitely will. But even there will probably be a physical limit. I mean, after all, microprocessors are getting smaller and smaller and smaller, but there is a limit there. It's imposed by matter
say
itself.
We're getting to the 5 nanometer scale now, and then the Heisenberg uncertainty principle kicks in. But then the idea is we're going to move to a new paradigm. So instead of silicon, we're going to have 3-dimensional or, quantum computers or what have you. And then that's Ray Kurzweil's argument of a whole sequence of S-curves of paradigms changes rather than a single curve.
Right. But if you notice what you just did, not you, but what Kurzweil just did was now, if you're saying, look, we're going to hit a limit and then some kind of paradigm shift happens, then first of all, those are just words. We don't know what kind of paradigm shift, if any, is going to happen. But now you cannot extrapolate from that curve anymore, because a paradigm shift means that now you're in a completely different kind of dynamic. You cannot just keep going on the same curve. The underlying process is now different. Mm-hmm. So we'll see. I might be wrong, but I think there's some reason for cautious skepticism about these kind of things.
Yeah, and I get that, and I think your second argument actually is much better than the first argument, if you ask me. But let me ask you, because we're really running out of time, and we're just diving into the meat of the matter here. So, where does transhumanism fit in? Or no, actually, before that, I wanted to ask you about teleology, and that's actually a very interesting point, because you're an evolutionary biology, so I want to get your take. Ray has this 6 epochs of the singularity, where you start with sort of physics and chemistry, then you go through biology, then you go through minds, then you go through technology, then you have the 5th one is the merger of technology and biology, and the 6th epoch is where he says the universe wakes up. So you have this, what I would call teleological, and those are mine words, not his words, a teleological movement from less to more intelligence. So you're an evolutionary biologist. What's your analysis of that? Because that's kind of your area of expertise. Is it fair for me to call it a teleological?
Yeah, I think it is. I think that's nice science fiction and not much else, quite frankly. So if there's one thing that science has demonstrated or has argued strongly over the last 300 years, is that there is no teleology in the universe. The universe doesn't have an end point, an omega point. It doesn't have a trajectory of any kind. Things just happen as a result of physical laws, as a result of physical, chemical, and biological processes. One of my favorite biologists of all time was Stephen Jay Gould. And Gould wrote an entire book on this issue of complexity, right? The evolution of complexity. And Gould's argument was very simple, and I think very, very convincing. He says, look, people often say, oh, there must be a reason why, biological evolution over the last several billion years has led to increasing complexity. More and more complex, and then you can pick any arbitrary number of points on that branching pattern, because that we have to remember, the evolution is not a sequence. Obviously, it's a branching. It's an incredibly complex branching pattern. But you can pick any number of points on this branching pattern and draw a nice line that shows that things have gone in a particular way. But Gould's argument was like, well, what else did you expect? Life had to start simple. It couldn't possibly start complex, because if it started complex, then it would be the result, a strong indication of intelligent design. Yeah. It had to start at the simplest possible level, the simplest possible cells, the smallest number of proteins, the smallest DNA, et cetera, et cetera. And so from there, where are you going to go? It's only going to get more complex. But it's going to get more complex because of competition, because the simple life forms are going to be at a disadvantage as soon as some higher level of complexity, more efficient, functionally is going to evolve. So this notion that there is a teleological sort of aspect to nature, I would think that would have gone down the drain. This was a very Aristotelian, of course. Aristotle was very much into teleology. But I would have thought that was sort of put to rest with the scientific revolution of the 17th and 18th centuries, and certainly with Darwin. But apparently it just keeps coming back for some reason. So I don't think there's much foundation to that. Also, again, people just throw words that I'm not sure. As a philosopher, the philosopher in me kicks in. Philosophy is very much about being careful about the words that you use, right? And so when Kurzweil says things like, "and the universe wakes up," the hell does that mean? I mean,
it means we're going to have smart dust and everything from Matryoshka brains and computroniums and, smart dust, that everything is smart. There's no dumb matter anymore left.
And I have no idea what that means. I mean, I understand the words, but I have no idea what that means as a scientist.
Okay, so and one other part of here of the teleology and I think actually Aristotle coined the term teleology, if I'm right.
Yes, that's right.
But one other subset of that kind of singularitarian take on teleology, which it's unrecognized perhaps within our community, is also transhumanism, and how itself it's a sort of a teleological ideology or idea or movement, if you will, because it kind of presumes that, again, there's this movement from less to more intelligence, which we go through, animal kingdom, then humanity, and then sort of transhumanity as the next step. So human is a step on evolution, and then transhuman is obviously, the next step of evolution. What do you think of that? You're an evolutionary biologist again.
Falls into the same. First of all, as you know, actually people mean different things by the word transhumanist. So it depends. I mean, we're talking about technological improvements. Are we talking about biological evolution? Because we're now close to be able to alter our own genome. So we could actually potentially.
We're talking about humanity getting in charge of its own evolutionary destiny. Whether with genetic engineering or whether with mind uploading or what have you, where we become in charge of evolution by design, if you will, by our own intelligent design rather than randomness.
Correct. So then there are two responses there from my perspective. One is, well, that's yet another example of teleology. There is no guarantee going anywhere. That could be a potential future, of course. Because it's logically consistent, so it's a potential future. Or we may go extinct, in the next 10 years, because we're going to finally cause some kind of major collapse, and then we're done with it. No trans anything. In fact, no human anything. So again, if somebody's saying, well, that's a possible trajectory for humanity, sure. If somebody on the other hand,
people even say it's inevitable.
Right. That's the part that I'm going to reject. There's nothing inevitable about that sort of stuff. In fact, I'm teaching a course this semester on science fiction and philosophy. And one of the chapters we're going to read next is the doomsday argument. And the doomsday argument basically argues that that there's fairly reasonable, philosophical arguments to suggest that no technological civilization would ever, in fact, last that long. Because if it had, then we would have actually seen it, because we would have, galaxy-wide expansion of that civilization. So this is an argument for the notion that at some point,
the Fermi paradox.
Yes, the Fermi paradox. At some point, technological civilizations are far more likely to actually go extinct than to go the next level. So I argue. So what I'm saying is, on the one hand, if you're telling me, if somebody's saying, this is a possible future, yes. If, on the other hand, they're arguing this is an inevitable future, no, because that's yet another case of teleology, which I don't think is supported by the science. It's another example of scala naturae, as it was called in Latin during the Middle Ages, right? But this notion that bacteria and viruses are at the bottom and human beings are at the top, and then above human beings is only God, right? And then we're striving toward that sort of situation. Well, a virus is just reminding us of how vulnerable we are, despite all our technology and all our pride in our intelligence and stuff like that. All it takes is a few proteins and a bit of RNA to cause it literally a worldwide shutdown and millions of people infected. So it's like, let's slow down here for a minute. So that's one thing. That's one response to the transhumanist scenario. The other response is, well, do we want to go that way? Even if we can. Right? That just because we can, that doesn't mean that we should. One of my favorite shows until recently was The Big Bang Theory, and there's a book called the philosophy of the Big Bang Theory, to which I contributed a chapter. And the chapter that I contributed to was about scientism. So this notion that whatever science does is good inherently, right? And it's the best way to go about it. And my chapter starts with a really interesting episode where the four geeky guys basically of the group are in their apartment doing the following thing. They've connected the light switch in their apartment via the internet to China. And then there's this guy in China who pushes a button and turns on and off the lights of their apartment, right? So Penny, who is the non-scientist and yet grounded in sort of common sense character, comes in, says what they're doing, and she says, okay, but why? Why are you doing this? And the four guys in unison respond, because we can, right? That's for them, that's the only motivation. That is lack of wisdom, the kind of lack of wisdom we were talking about earlier. No, you don't do things just because you can. You ask yourself, if you can do things, then you ask yourself, yes, but is this a good idea? Is this a good thing to do?
And actually, right? This brings me very well to the best, or one of the best definitions of ethics, which is having the power of doing something, but knowing whether you should or you shouldn't actually do that thing. That's where ethics comes, in my opinion.
Exactly. So, as you know, there are different sort of types of science fiction stories. There's those that are optimistic about the future, like the original Star Trek, for instance, right? Gene Roddenberry was a humanist, and he was, very optimistic about the future. And then there are the dystopians, like Philip K. Dick, for instance, right? No story by Philip K. Dick ends well, and they're all about the disastrous effects of essentially lack of wisdom that we're talking about, right? And I tend to be a little bit more on the dystopian side of things. Again, I completely agree that technology has brought wonderful things to us, and I take full advantage of those things. But I am worried about when some people, especially people with large egos and a lot of money, begin to say things like, oh, we can alter our own DNA and take evolution in our own hands. I can see so many ways in which this could go really bad, really wrong, that I am seriously worried. Also, there are, as you pointed out, ethical issues here. Other than the potential lack of wisdom of the people who might be in charge of these kind of efforts. Well, precisely who should be in charge of this thing? Who should be making these decisions? If we're talking about, literally altering the future course of human evolution, should we actually leave this kind of decision to some scientist, to some technologist, to some entrepreneur? Why? What about the rest of us? I mean, there's 6 billion people on the planet. Why is it that this discussion should be going on at those levels? Those are literally, changing the future of humanity. And it seems like anything of that magnitude ought to be discussed very seriously and pursued very carefully. And if there is one attribute of Kurzweil that doesn't strike me as the right one, is that he's not a cautious person. He's throws himself into those kind of things, which is typical of technologists and typical of scientists to some extent.
And inventors. They embrace the proactionary rather than precautionary principle. And that's correct. A very well-established and well-embraced principle within the transhumanist community. Yeah. Now, Massimo, that has been sort of like the point of my work for the last 10 years, at least since I started my podcast, trying to bring ethics within this conversation and go back to sort of, if you will, dive into the ancient wisdom of the Greeks and the Romans and see how we can apply that to our everyday life. Now, unfortunately, I feel like I've abused your time here today and I've taken so much of it, but I'm really enjoying it. So I'm just going to ask you the last 2 questions so that we can wrap it up. And hopefully this will be the first of several conversations, perhaps. So what is the best place for people to find more about you and your work?
The best couple of places are my comprehensive website, which is massimopigliucci.com. You'll find there everything, all the new essays or links to new books and podcasts and videos and all that sort of stuff. It's all there. It's including a lot of freely available downloadable material. And then on Twitter at mpigliucci, Mpigliucci.
Mm-hmm. Very well. So, Massimo, we discussed 1 hour. I've kept you a lot longer than that. Thank you very much for this. But if you were to send us away with a single most important message that we should take away from this maybe 70-minute conversation with you today, what would you like that to be?
that we should accompany our science and technology with a good dose of philosophy.
And that's a message that I can only embrace. So, Professor Massimo Pigliucci, thank you so much for being with us today. I really appreciate your time.
It was a pleasure. Thank you for having me.
If you guys enjoyed this show, you can help me make it better in a couple of ways. You can go and write a review on iTunes, or you can simply make a donation.